in the open in the firestorm were so severely burned that their bodies shrank from adult size to the size of babies or dolls. How many people were picked up by the firestorm, burning and flung away in the vortex of these terrible winds. These were frightful effects of the bombing. And the point about them is that they were deliberate, because the Royal Air Force thought very carefully about what its bomb load would be like. It had 25% high explosives, 75% incendiaries. And these incendiaries had an early form of napalm, petroleum jelly, phosphorus, bituminous substances, and oil-soaked rags. And the phosphorus, if it splashed as it did, it was designed to splash over a very wide area. If it splashed onto a human being, that person would begin to burn very fiercely. And they might, as thousands of people did in Hamburg, throw themselves into the canals to put out the flames, only to find, to their horror, that when they got out of the water, it would reignite spontaneously. It was a terrible collection of weapons that were dropped with the aim of doing as much harm as possible to the civilian population in those cities. Now these facts, and they are terrible facts, could be countered by saying, look, war is terrible. You know, horrible things happen in war, and when it's a war to the death and a war against a very formidable and wicked enemy as the Nazi regime was, you know, the gloves are off. And this has sometimes been very, very well expressed in a chilling phrase by no less a person than Mao Zedong, who once said, war is not crochet. And everything that follows from that follows. And when people say this to me, my response to them is to say, would that mean that it's okay in the course of a war to bayonet babies? Which is a sort of shocking thought, a shocking thing to say. And most people say, well, no, of course not. And most people would agree that something like My Lai in Vietnam was a crime, which implies that there are limits. And that instantly raises the question, where do the limits lie? And it raises the further question, was the systematic bombing of civilian populations in Germany and Japan beyond the limits? And to examine that question, and the book is dedicated to it, and I haven't got much time, but very, very briefly, what I have to do and try to do in the book is to look at the argument that says, no, it wasn't beyond the limits in the context of the war. That is, that if there was a genuine military necessity, if it really helped to win the war, then that fact trumps our moral scruples about doing this. And so that becomes the key focus of the discussion, really, to ask whether it really did help to win the war. And the answer is that it didn't. People say that by bombing the cities, keeping the workers awake when they weren't killed, making life difficult for the German population and administration as a whole because of the disruption caused by bombing, that it must have done something to slow down, to dent German production. It must also, of course, have kept forces back in Germany, anti-aircraft forces, troops and aircraft to defend against these attacks. The second of those two arguments can be very quickly and simply met, which is to say that no matter what you were bombing, even if you were bombing transport and factories and military installations and roads, they would have had to keep back anti-aircraft guns and aircraft. So that doesn't defend area bombing, attacks on civilians. But as to the question of industrial production of all kinds, not just military production, increased year on year in Germany until the end of 1944. The German economy, which was very, very strong by the time war broke out, and which, as a result of conquests in Central and Eastern Europe, had vast manpower resources, vast natural resources available to it following those conquests, was never put on a war footing. It was never the case that a single German woman was conscripted into a factory to make weapons, as was the case, for example, in Britain. There was so much labour that could be drafted in from Eastern Europe, slave labour and prisoner labour, that there was never any necessity for it. And production of all things, including luxury items and double beds and flower pots and all the rest of it, went on and on right until the end of 1944. And what stopped it was the drying up of fuel, coal and oil and gas. And that was the result of attempts at precision bombing, tactical daylight bombing, very dangerous, by the United States Army Air Force, who were only, as it happens, those of you who've read about this will know, really effective from very late 1943 and 1944 certainly onwards, because of the Mustang fighter aircraft, long-range fighter aircraft, could fly all the way from the east coast of England to Berlin and back, and could protect the bombers, And it was in fact the Mustangs and Lightnings that accompanied the bomber fleets which fought the Luftwaffe out of the sky. On D-Day there were something like 12,000 Allied aircraft in operation over France, and something like 800 Luftwaffe aircraft to defend against them. And so the effect that the United States endeavours had in the European theatre was a very considerable one. So the major argument that the area bombing, that is bombing civilian populations by night, was a major factor in helping to win the war, looks very questionable. Just to be brief, because I'm sure I'm running over time, I must turn attention to the American endeavours in the Pacific theatre. And there, I'm afraid, the United States went 180 degrees in the opposite direction from what they had done in the European theatre. There's no question of precision bombing in Japan once the Mariana Islands had been captured and airfields built there, so that the main islands of Japan were within range of the Pacific bombing force under the direction of Curtis LeMay, a well-known name, I think. There was hardly any Japanese Air Force left at that time, and precious little anti-aircraft defence on the ground in mainland Japan. And so Curtis LeMay told his flyers to strip out the guns, the defence of the aircraft themselves, since they just made the aircraft heavier, to fill them up with incendiary bombs, and to bomb from a low altitude, and to burn the cities of Japan. And this he did systematically in the last 8 months or so, or 9 months of the war. The first great incendiary attack was on Tokyo on the 9th and 10th of March 1945, when 85,000 people were burned to death in that city. I was told by an email correspondent just before I flew over the Atlantic to come here about the work that was done at the Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah near Salt Lake City prior to the bombing campaign over Japan, where replicas of wooden Japanese houses were built so that they could test which kind of incendiary bomb would burn it most effectively. And so the campaign was, of course, a well thought out and deliberate one, and it was a tremendously destructive one. In the 9 months or so of the bombing of Japan, as many people were killed and wounded in Japan among the civilian population, as were killed and wounded in Germany by bombing in the whole of the war. So about 350,000 dead and about 800,000 injured in both cases, although the figures, of course, are very approximate. And I suppose the final point about the United States Army Air Force endeavours in the Pacific theatre is that more than 4 months before the atom bombs were dropped on the 6th and 9th of August 1945, the Japanese had begun to make overtures for a truce, for a ceasefire. They were doing it through the Russians, who weren't at that time at war with them. The Russians only declared war on Japan on the 6th of August 1945, when it was going to be an easy land grab. You still have some of the Japanese islands, as you know. And so the Japanese made overtures to the United States through the Russians. And there was one condition, and that was that they could keep the emperor. But you may remember that Roosevelt and Churchill had decided at Casablanca that there were to be no conditions, and this was used, some people say, as an excuse by the Truman administration not to talk to the Japanese about a ceasefire until the atom bombs had been dropped. To the very, very great credit of a man called Henry Stimson, who was Secretary of Defense in the Roosevelt administration, he tried to dissuade Truman from dropping a bomb on a populated city. He said, drop one of them on an uninhabited island to show what the weapon can do. But his suggestion wasn't taken. And so he struck the word Kyoto off the list of possible targets of the atom bombs, because he knew of the significance of that city. Now, looking back on it now from this perspective, and this is my final point, one notices that in the immediate aftermath of the war, that is in the years from 1945 to 1949, tremendous endeavours were made by the international community, by the world as a whole, you might say, to try to put in place a framework of law, or at very least of principles, which would make the things that had happened during the course of the war impossible. I mean, that was the ideal that people set themselves when they wrote and agreed upon the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example. And it was certainly the aim of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which was written and signed in 1949, the Convention on the Protection of Civilians in War. That convention, in its draft form, had in it some clauses which specifically protect civilians from attacks by bombing.